The International Institute for Peace recently introduced a series of interviews with experts from its neighboring countries. And I'm very happy that today we can talk to Vasyl Filipchuk, and he's a senior advisor at the International Center for Policy Studies, and he's an expert on foreign policy, the European Union, European neighborhood, and is based in Kyiv in Ukraine. Today we are going to talk about the situation in Ukraine, the domestic situation, but also the war in the eastern part of the country, but also what it means for the future of Ukraine and the region. And if you want to check out our videos, you can go to our webpage, iipvienna.com. Vasyl, thank you very much for talking to me today. I'm very happy. I hope everything is good. You and your family are well, so welcome.
Thank you.
I would like to start maybe first with the question about the domestic situation now within Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky was elected last year, and I would say it was quite a surprise in the beginning that a comedian became president of Ukraine, and he won by 70%, more than 70%. His ambitions were very high. He wanted to end the war in Donbas, NATO accession. He wanted to attract more investments, fight corruption, reform the judicial system. So quite a huge package. And now, of course, Ukraine was also hit by the pandemic, not only from within the country, but also the neighboring countries. Russia is in lockdown, Ukraine is in lockdown, the European Union is in lockdown. How would you assess the situation now for the people living in Ukraine? What are the measures? How do they cope? What does it mean for the economy? And how are the measures also communicated by the government? Like, how is the government now performing in this very difficult situation?
So everything is relative. It depends how you compare it with what you expected and what you have. Relatively speaking, we are okay. If you look at number of infections, at number of deaths, Ukraine is in incomparably better situations than even closest neighbors. When we see that in Russia, 100,000 infections a day, when we see in Poland, not to speak about Italy or Spain, in our country we have daily rate of infection about 500, 300 to 600, but overall daily 450, 520, something like that. Daily rate of death is about 20. So for 45 million country, it's not a lot. You don't really see, I have no one from people whom I know who has suffered serious problems because of COVID. Yes, I knew two persons who were infected, but in both cases it was okay. And when I speak to my colleagues in the office and to my friends, we all just know about COVID from TV screens, not from people whom we know, people who are in the same offices as we are. At the beginning, drastic efforts of the government were received with surprise, but you speak about the country which has an experience of Chernobyl, and we all remember how after Chernobyl, a reaction from the authority was not harsh, and it was widely criticized. So with memory of Chernobyl, with memory of Soviet schooling about bio and chemical threats from the West, and I remember myself how in school we were learning how to behave during chemical or biological attacks, how to prepare masks by your own hands, where to run, what to do. And I don't know what exactly was this memory about Chernobyl, this traditions of defense, civil defense, civil protection against possible biological attacks, or maybe it's wide vaccination which we had in Soviet Union, what helped for us to have not bad situation in terms of healthcare now. So overall, despite of wide criticism that there is not enough medicine, that the hospitals are not renovated, but I'd never seen any report that the hospitals are full of people infected and there is no place for them just because of limited number of infections. Problems with testing is one of the most serious ones. Government announced a decision to make tests, and in reality, you see that access to tests is really limited. However, what I see from our everyday life, if you call ambulance, first thing what they do when they come to you, even if you call them for something different, is what they are testing you with express tests. Again, widely criticized, express tests are not correct, badly prepared, and so on. If you feel any problem and if you comply with 4 criteria for testing, normally you can easily make testing at every hospital. I personally had 3 tests already after this 2 months of COVID, and every time I must tell it was all very good, civilized, well done. So I would say again, despite of our critical assessment, things are more or less acceptable in terms of healthcare. Where I see a big problem is with economic situation and with capabilities of public administration institutions to deal with future challenges we are going to face because of COVID. And I can just show you, if you want, from my window, and you would see today's problem which we had while coming to office. Actually, today we are the second day after end of. Do you see what is now in front of my window? It's buses. So trade union of transportation. So basically, companies which are providing private companies which are providing transportation from between cities, they organized today a protest. Yesterday there was another protest from small and medium businesses, and last week there was a whole week of protests. Owners of hotels, owners of restaurants, and many other small businesses, because people really started to feel this month they cannot keep this pressure and financial difficulties. If first month it was okay, second month it was still tolerable, now it's really difficult. By social polls, people I think about 70% of people said they have savings for 3 weeks. Of course, people are not always telling the truth about how much savings they have. Probably they have for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, but it's all over. And we just I see by my colleagues in the office, by people whom I speak in place where I live, we see it from media reports. It's over. People cannot really stay longer at home. People need to feed their kids. Situation is, I would not say hopeless, but seems already rather critical. And government, while declaring on one side that we have not yet passed so-called plateau, and number of infections is still higher than number of people who left hospitals, and it's still, the threat is still there. We see that overall people are pressing the government, and government responds with some steps to soften quarantine and allowing, for example, open air restaurants to functions and so on. But on the other side, government keeps still lockdown of key transport lines. For example, for the city of Kyiv, it doesn't matter whether we have lockdown or not, but if our metropolitan, our subway network is closed, city is closed. We are talking about 4 million people living in the city, and every day more than 1 million is using underground networks, subway network, and it's still closed. Moreover, government is saying it's not going to open for upcoming months. And without this, even if you open a restaurant or you open a barber shop, you still cannot work, because people cannot come to you neither for work nor for getting services because they cannot get to work. Without public transportation, we can use only taxis. Price for taxis, of course, are biting. You cannot really pay for or your employees everyday taxi. It would just become pointless to open your business, and it's now the key problem, the key issue for people. So we consider we have a little bit phasing out of quarantine, but in reality we are still in lockdown because of a public transportation problem. And the same with situation with other regions and interregional links. As you could see, people are protesting because basically without interregional movement, economy cannot get back to normal. Moreover, while in other countries we see so-called helicopter subsidies, we see certain steps from the government to give direct subsidies to vulnerable groups of population, to give support to small and medium enterprises. In our case, we just don't see it. We are talking about the government, which doesn't have huge reserves. We are talking about the government which has 40% of budget to be spent for foreign payments. We are talking about the government which has difficulties even to pay pensions for $170 or $180 per pensioners. And for them, even to give $200-300 social subsidies because of COVID, or $500 or $1,000 subsidies to small companies to help them at least pay for rent. It's not happening, and it's really difficult without such kind of help, especially for the most vulnerable group of population. And again, we come to the same conclusion that while government cannot help people to stay home and pay for the most needed vital expenses, people would just leave and go and search for where they can work and where they can make money. So it's one problem. Another problem is more systemic. What we see is that our economy and public institution really has been getting ruined over the last maybe 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union, and it seems to be steps road going down. We see every year that overall our GDP is decreasing. Our GDP per capita is getting less and less. Last year, we surprisingly for us became the poorest country in Europe. We see that parts of economy which we were proud of, like engineering, automobile building, and others, are getting killed by different obstacles, reasons, factors, opening of Ukraine's markets, inability to withstand pressure from other economies. The most important, government unable to protect and help economy, unable to respond to basic needs of economy, and judiciary unable to protect basic property rights, justice in society. Because of all this system of problems, we see that every year economy was getting weaker and weaker, and what is happening now may be the breakdown moment when certain parts of economy would just finally collapse and be unable to get back to normal, to revive. We had something very similar in 1991, 1993, then in 1998, then in 2008, then after Russian aggression in 2014. But there was certain, let's say, limit of resistance, limit of viability inside of economy. And we see now that limits are now just exhausted, and there is less and less potential for economic entities to survive. And at the end of the day, we could just discover that even if lockdown is over, there will be nowhere to go to work. And it's the biggest worry which I see now in our society. And it's supplemented by decreasing capability of the government, visible weakness of the government, visible weakness of public authorities, which are again not a problem of current president or prime minister, which is a problem which we inherited from the previous political regimes. But now, when COVID came, all these problems were just exposed to everyone, and we just see, for example, yesterday's main news was that government provided regions with additional payment to healthcare workers. Doctors in Ukraine receive $150 to $200. And doctors and nurses who for this money, normal salary in business is $500-700, and doctors who risk their life have $200. So the government decided to increase their salary. Government found some resources to pay this salary to healthcare workers, and they had to receive so-called triple salary in April. And then huge news was last 2 weeks that in some regions they received half of normal salary, and basically in no single region they really received triple salary. And the question, who lied? Government showed figures that they disbursed money to regions, and they somewhere disappeared. Regions paid debts, region paid some other urgent payments. Some regions are saying we have not received, and it's really scandal. Some people were already fired yesterday by the government because of that, but it just shows huge problem of institutional weakness of Ukrainian government, regional administration, local self-government. And even if you have money with such kind of weak government, it's very difficult to deal. I was told that World Bank, for example, is ready to provide Ukraine with credits for support to the most vulnerable groups. Other international institutions are looking for providing support, but the government seems to be unable just to provide all the necessary documents to get this support from them. And despite of huge demand for financial funds, level of usage of funds given from international financial institutions is 20-30%. So it's all just create a bit different picture, which forces us to think about, first of all, not healthcare, but about governmental ability to function and economic viability in the country. In this context, problem with the East, which you asked, have been a bit sidelined. It's not anymore so urgent on the top of our agenda as it used to be. We, on one side, had a very good progress from President Zelensky and his team in settlement of the conflict. They have showed their strong commitment and readiness and will to make progress with the settlement of the conflict in Donbas. On the other side, we have seen last months number of limitations to which they arrived and unable to deal with because of number of serious problems, starting from some absolutely difficult to deal with elements of Minsk agreements, which, for example, provide for a discussion with representatives of de facto authorities, people from so-called Donetsk Luhansk People Republic, which had been strongly attacked by right-wing hawks who were against of any contacts with de facto authorities. All the attempts to establish such kind of dialogue faced refusal, and without this you cannot settle some of demands from Minsk agreements. Moreover, all the pro-peace efforts have been undermined by also shelling and not stable ceasefire on the contact line, and every new death of our soldiers on contact line led to a new wave of criticism against pro-peace inclination of Mr. Zelensky. So we expected that in April we would have a new meeting of Normandy 4. We see, of course, because of COVID and because of lack of progress, it didn't take place. We see now that with COVID, agenda of our partners has been changed, and we see that they are not paying so much attention to a problem in Donbas. We all expected window of opportunity to be open till May because of Russian internal developments. Now we see that this window of opportunity has been fully lost. Is it moved for summer? Big question. We don't see any evidences which would confirm that things might change to the better. We have local elections in October this year, and initial planning was that these elections could be already on the territory of the whole of the country. We don't see now serious steps to prepare it, and time is running. We have basically, if elections in October, they have to be announced in July, and we are now mid-May, so basically we have less than 2 months, and to prepare elections on not controlled territories, it's enormous political, logistical, financial, administrative problem, and there is no even attempts to settle this problem because of COVID and because of a certain deadlock in settlement process. So we remain in a atmosphere of ambiguity, and expect that maybe now with certain softening of quarantine, there could be a new momentum for peace negotiations.
Thank you very much. So your assessment would be that health-wise, the situation within Ukraine is actually not that bad, but of course you face many, especially also practical problems with transportation. The economic situation is very severe, but you also mentioned that the civil society is quite active, also demanding that these things need to be changed, need to be eased a little bit. You also already jumped a little bit into the situation in eastern Ukraine, because Ukraine is in a very specific situation with the still ongoing war in the eastern part of the country, and the annexation of Crimea on the other hand, of course. And there, the question which I would also like to ask you is, what about the humanitarian situation there? We know that before, around 30,000 people would cross every day the contact line, a line where there's still like more or less on a daily basis shelling. So people would go there to catch their pensions, to get their social insurance money. And now these checkpoints are also closed. The OSCE has difficulties in access of the area. And on the other hand, the border to Russia also seems to be closed. So people living in there, you have the feeling they are quite in economic and also diplomatic isolation. I mean, how would you assess also the humanitarian situation now within, especially the Donbas region, Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic? And what about Crimea?
We don't have enough information about situation both in not controlled territory in Donbas and in occupied territory of Crimea. After announcement of lockdown and quarantine, any movement on contact line has stopped. Actually, any movement on contact line with Crimea also stopped. And of course, it created serious problems for people who are living on not controlled territories. We see they have not followed Ukrainian pattern of lockdown, but more followed Russian. There was still celebration of Day of Victory, 9th of May. There was celebration of other events. And what we see from media, people are not following the same strict restrictions which we have in mainland Ukraine. On the other side, we don't have information about how many people have been infected. And here, maybe as the fact that both entities are isolated helped to avoid high rate of infection, or maybe we just don't know. Maybe people are dying because of this infection, but it's identified as just normal flu or something different. From my point of view, pandemia is always, or any crisis is always a good moment to show a hand of help, hand of support, which would attract sympathies of people who are on not controlled territories. But our government was unable to provide them any significant assistance, any humanitarian assistance. Yes, international institutions like UN or private foundations continued to provide not controlled territories population with vitally important things. But overall, this moment was not used for improvement of relationship and for improvement of perception of Ukraine inside of both Crimea and not controlled territories. And maybe it's obvious again because of COVID we have fully changed internal agenda for Ukrainian government. Now we have just to see and wait to what extent government will be able to open contact line, to open movement. Again, we see from Mr. Zelensky a different approach than from his predecessor in treatment people from the not controlled territories. The last example of this attitude was decision of our negotiating team, first of all, to increase level of our presence at this negotiating team. On the other side, they decided to invite to negotiating team people directly from IDPs communities in Ukraine. And we see that maybe now when quarantine would soften, our government would open contacts and do what President promised, like paying pensions and providing vital support. But again, logistically, how it's going to be done, it's quite difficult now to see. If we have political settlements, then yes, then you can easily imagine how it would work. But without political settlement, all these good intentions will be quite difficult to implement. And even more, if you read news from Crimea, you see that Russians are increasing control, and any attempts, at least to keep contacts with Kyiv, is punished very heavily by Russian authorities. So on Crimea, I would say that the situation is even worse.
So you mentioned especially also the lack of information and also the problem of the political settlement. And Crimea is still different than from eastern Ukraine, from the Donbas region. But maybe if we switch a little bit to the external actors, I mean, we have maybe on the one hand the European Union on the one hand, and then Russia, the big neighbor, and also the historical shared past in a sense of the Soviet Union. But you also mentioned then the 8th of May celebrations, and I guess that there is a different narrative in Ukraine on the one hand, maybe in Russia on the other hand, and also within Europe. I mean, we feel that many European countries and Western European countries do not really know about the role Ukraine had in the Second World War and the many humanitarian losses, the many killed people. So this commemoration, maybe you can give us a little bit about how this is perceived, what is the narrative in Ukraine, and then the European Union role in probably settling the conflict, supporting Ukraine on one hand while having the pandemic, while having the difficulties within the European Union itself, and Russia on the other hand. So very big and broad question. Maybe you can just
for yet another half an hour of our conference. So I will just mention shortly some points. First of all, it's a very painful issue. We had, unfortunately, after Maidan, we lost certain traditions which existed in Ukraine of tolerance and dialogue inside of society. And we see that all the efforts which I personally, my team, and many like-minded people in Ukraine to renew this atmosphere where Ukrainians could discuss peacefully history or complicated elements of their political, social life, they have been under certain pressure or even attack from previous regime or from right-wing radical extremist forces. It's directly reflected with number of cases, events like Day of Victory. For some part of society, it's a day of tragedy, a symbol of Stalinist Soviet Union fully taking over control over Ukraine. For majority of population, Day of Victory, it's a big celebration day of victory over Nazi. Moreover, that, as you rightly said, Ukraine was not just a battlefield. Yes, it was battlefield, and we really lost. I read different assessment, but some of assessment are saying that we lost about 18 million people. 18 million people. And the worst thing was that our people were from both sides. Part of Ukrainians were in Ukrainian independent army fighting against Soviet army. But majority of course Ukrainians were in Ukrainian fronts of Soviet army. So there are different assessments, and it's even reflected in different days of celebration. On 8th of May, previous president announced Day of Commemoration, but he didn't cancel 9th of May, Day of Victory. So some people are going to streets on 8th of May to commemorate and talk about crimes of Soviet regime, but majority are going on streets on 9th of May to celebrate Day of Victory. And it just shows the whole complexity of the situation in the country. Thanks God we have not had this year what happened 2 or 3 years ago when old 90 years old veterans were putting flowers to different monuments and they were beaten by right-wing radicals. Thanks God this year it didn't take place. And I must also acknowledge that our president was very diplomatic, both on 8th of May, showing signs of commemoration, and on 9th of May, greeting with Day of Victory. So he's trying to unite both narratives in one. But again, society is not yet ready. And here, by the way, foreign assistance, foreign experience would be very much helpful, as we are not the first one who are passing the same difficulties. And if other countries who went through the same, like in Balkans or in EU, would share their experience and would have dialogue, it would be really very good. On EU, again, this pandemic a bit decreased visibility and role of EU. We don't really see now much in EU integration or in EU agenda in Ukraine. Certainly, facts of EU solidarity being undermined during COVID were shocking for many Ukrainian politicians, and it's against the image which always was before in this country, that EU is united, and in case of tragedies, EU is always helping to others and helping outside. We don't see really any help now from the EU side, except that EU agreed to pay Ukraine a new tranche of macro-financial assistance, which is a loan for balanced trade deficit of Ukraine in trade with the EU. But again, we have to understand that EU member states also have their own crisis inside. Perception of Russia remains again quite ambiguous, and we don't see now anything dramatically changing. We see that Russia is in a very interesting internal period of transition, and we cannot really predict what is happening, what will be happening there soon, and to what extent Russian leadership will be ready for returning to respect Ukrainian independence, borders, and ready to equal dialogue with Ukrainians on renewal of our sovereignty and returning relations to normal. We see that, as I mentioned, the window of opportunity is closing, and what is happening in that country, even to Russian media and Russian experts, is now difficult to understand. With all of it, it all led during internal dialogue and discussions to certain, let's say, elements of a new public narrative in society that we have to expect not so much on foreign external assistance, but we have to look for getting internal resources to settle our problem. We should not expect that good Germans, Americans, or Russians would come and help us with our problems. We should really understand that in current world we have first of all to rely on ourselves, and it may be good conclusion, because all these naive expectations that only EU accession can settle Ukraine's problem, or only NATO membership can help us in dealing with Russia, all these naive things had to sooner or later to be thrown away, and people had to understand difficult realities in which we are all now in. So maybe it's good news that Ukrainian political class and society became more rational in what they expect now from foreign players, and responsible for what they have to do themselves inside of the country.
Thank you very much, Vasyl. I think it's very interesting that what you have been mentioning also about the narratives, and also that Ukraine needs to tackle the problems from within, maybe also in the future, complementary with the help from the European Union. Nowadays, it seems to be quite difficult. So thank you very much for taking your time. I hope that we manage to meet soon again, personally, either in Kyiv or in Vienna. And good luck, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.